Scripture reading is from Ecclesiastes 1, verses 1 through 11. So if you have your Bible at home, that would be good for you to take it out and keep it open to this passage. This is the Word of God. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be. What has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, "See, this is new"? It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. What is needed most during this unusually trying time is perspective. We gain some perspective from watching the news and looking at statistics, but the perspective we most need will not be found on television or coronavirus websites. The perspective our souls need most for this crisis or for any day in our lives is what the Creator has revealed to us in the Bible. God has revealed to us everything that we need to know to guide us through the pleasures and pain of life, including the greatest challenge of life, which is death itself. So I preach today with the international crisis in mind. But if you did not hear last Sunday's sermon entitled God and the Coronavirus, you can find it on our church website or on the Bethel podcast. I will not repeat most of what I said last week. For today and next Sunday, I chose passages from the book of Ecclesiastes because Solomon, writing some 4,000 years ago, has something to say to the situation we find ourselves in during this crisis of global disease. The writer acutely feels the oppression of life's twists and turns and draws some profound conclusions concerning the living of our lives, especially when we're faced with the weight of life's dark clouds and when we are faced with questions without clear answers, like we find ourselves in today, this situation. Ecclesiastes is a very unique book in the Bible. It presents an unusual look at, to use the words of Ecclesiastes, life under the sun, from the standpoint of a diligent inquirer who is contemplating meaning and order concerning his life. The author is trying to make sense of the events of living, and he looks around and observes things. He studies earthly life to try to see what conclusions he can draw. So the book is a journey through the eyes of a very inquisitive mind. The writer examines life as if he holds it in his hand, turning it again and again to see every facet, every part of life, trying to understand its ebb and flow. He does not make up hypothetical questions. He simply articulates the questions that life itself presents. He pulls us into his world of inquiry. And once we are there, we also feel the frustration that results from seeing the questions that arise. As we read the descriptions so vividly formed in this book, we find ourselves saying, yes, I felt that way. I've wondered that myself. The book brings the reader almost to despair as the preacher, as he describes himself in the first verse, asks his questions, while only dropping hints along the way of the grand conclusion that he will present in the last chapter of the book. His questions are not arbitrary. They are well-chosen observations designed to eliminate all the man-made props that we use to cope with life's problems. This is why the book is so relevant to the situation that we're in today. Solomon's questions and keen observations knock down all the supports that we build. Knock them down one by one until we are left with the only one absolute in which to place our trust, the living God. Not health, not money, not relationships, not strategies, not technology, not government. The only hope there is for any of us, every day of our lives, is the Almighty. We should be able to see that more clearly now than we ever have in our lives. All the things that we normally look to provide security for our lives are being quickly and shockingly shaken. And all of a sudden we see that these things are not able to provide us with the security that is utterly reliable. That role, as has ever and always been the case, belongs to the Creator alone. Let us turn to him, beloved, in a new and deeper way as our only and glorious hope. Any help we receive in our need is ultimately from him. The means of help might be earthly: doctor, spouse, friend, neighbor, but the source of the help is God himself. And so, beloved, let us give God his due in praise, in thanksgiving, in pleading, in hope. The journey of Ecclesiastes begins with the preacher, as the writer refers to himself, observing the seemingly endless and sometimes disheartening repetition that permeates every single facet of life every day. And so I'd like to read one more time the first 3 verses of the book as you follow along. The words of the preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? We do not find the name of the author of Ecclesiastes in this book. Like many Old Testament books, Ecclesiastes is anonymous. But having said that, the author does identify himself in a way that tells us decisively that Solomon wrote this little book. The first verse of the book contains a description that fits only Solomon, son of David, king in Jerusalem. David had many sons, but only one of them was king in Jerusalem. Of course, son of David could mean descendant of David. But in addition to verse 1, we read in Ecclesiastes 1:16 about the extent of the author's wisdom. And in chapter 2, verse 8, about the number of concubines the author had. And also in chapter 2, about his wealth and his building projects. These descriptions do fit what we know about Solomon. It is interesting that Solomon calls himself the preacher here in verse 1. He does not position himself as royalty, even though he is royalty. He positions himself as a wise man, seeking to understand life and making a proclamation in his 12-chapter book. He refers to himself as the preacher 7 times in Ecclesiastes, 3 times in chapter 1, once in chapter 7, and 3 times again at the end in chapter 12. So at the beginning and the end of this book, Solomon is a representative of wisdom. In fact, he proclaims himself as the wisest of men in chapter 1, verse 16. In posturing himself as wise, what he's showing us is that when someone tries to put all the pieces of life together, even the wisest of people, he or she will fail in the attempt. It cannot be done. The main premise of the book, which presents the reader with perplexing food for thought, is repeated many times in these 12 chapters. The premise sets Solomon up for his grand conclusion in the final chapter, which he hints at along the way. We see the premise in the very first declaration that the preacher makes. And then, like a recurring drumbeat, this theme is sounded again and again and again in the book. And here's the premise. Vanity of vanities. Here Solomon says it twice for emphasis. And then he says, all is vanity. Vanity of vanities 3 times in the book. All is vanity 7 times in the book. And he uses some form of the word vanity some 40 times in 12 chapters. The vanity of life is a major theme of this book. To say vanity of vanities is a way of lending intensity to the word. If we read King of Kings and Lord of Lords, it refers to unrivaled majesty. A servant of servants is the lowest of slaves. The Holy of Holies is the most sacred place. So vanity of vanities is the most intensive idea of vanity. But what does Solomon mean when he uses the word vanity? What does he mean when he says all life is vain? The word vanity has been variously translated. In the NIV, we read meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. The Living Bible says nothing is worthwhile, and then uses the word futile. Surprisingly, the contemporary English version, which is a very free paraphrase, does grasp the sense of the phrase when it renders the Hebrew words with nothing makes sense. The Hebrew word here translated vanity is literally vapor. Figuratively, it refers to something that you cannot grasp, like vapor. 3 different meanings can be assigned to the word in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's used almost 40 times. First, it refers to the temporary and fleeting nature of life, like a vapor that quickly is blown away. All is vain, meaning all is temporary and short. Second, the word refers to the seeming futility of life with all its twists and turns, the frustrations of life. And third, and this is the way that Solomon uses this word more times in Ecclesiastes than the other two meanings. The word translated vanity in the ESV refers to the incomprehensible nature of life. Solomon is saying, and he says it over 30 times in this book, that life is vain, not in the sense that it's meaningless, not in the sense that it's not worth living, but in the sense that it cannot be fully comprehended. To try to understand life in its totality is like trying to catch the morning mist in your hands. We have a lot of pieces to the puzzle, it's true. But they don't all fit together in a coherent picture. This is exactly what Solomon says. Chapter 3, verse 11. God has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Chapter 7, verse 14. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. We have eternity in our hearts, so we long to see the picture whole. We long to understand the days of life in general and the days of our personal lives in particular. But when we look around, so many things do not seem to fit into neat, predictable patterns and categories. It's a great frustration to that. This coronavirus certainly doesn't fit into any categories that we have. Sometimes the turtles come in first, and the rabbits come in last. The race is not always to the swift, so says Solomon. The battle is not always to the strong. Sometimes good, decent people barely eke out a living, while drug lords in Mexico and pornographers in Los Angeles live like kings. Why does a newborn baby who has done nothing die when Charles Manson lived until he was 83? And sicknesses ravage people of every age, causing people to become blind or quadriplegic. No doubt some moral, decent people will die from the coronavirus, while some thieves and rapists will not get the disease at all. Sometimes fools sit on thrones while wise men take the garbage to the landfill. Why? And so we hear the desperate question of Ecclesiastes 1:3. What does man gain from all the toil which he toils under the sun? Under the sun. Solomon uses the phrase under the sun 31 times in Ecclesiastes, and it refers to life in the observable world around us, earthly life. What does man gain, he says? The word gain here is a business term. The King James translation is very good in this verse. It uses the word profit. The business term refers to what's left over on the balance sheet. We would say, what's the bottom line? When the expenses are subtracted from revenues, what's left is the profit margin. When referring to life, the question becomes, when everything is considered, what does a person have to show for his or her life in the end? After all our days and all our work and accumulation of things ends in death. We come with nothing we leave with nothing. Well, we might reason, hopefully we leave behind a better world for our children. Oh, really? Solomon is wise enough to question whether or not that noble desired goal is ever realized in the broad scheme of things. So Solomon launches into the section of this chapter that one commentator calls everlasting sameness, in which the preacher eloquently describes the cyclical nature of things. Ecclesiastes 1:4 is the general statement, followed by 3 illustrations of that statement from nature. Ecclesiastes 1, verses 4 through 7. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. The general statement is that generation after generation comes and goes, but things remain virtually the same. He points to 3 illustrations from nature to highlight his point. Verse 5, the sun. The sun makes an endless succession of rounds, rising and setting, rising and setting. It is so predictable that scientists, knowing the exact rotation of the earth, can announce the very minute it will rise on any given day in the future. For Solomon, this repetitive regularity only reminds him of the burdensome cycles of his own life. Verse 6, the wind. The swirling wind, now blowing from the east, now from the south, never seems to be done with its work. We do sometimes feel like the wind going in circles with no end in sight. Verse 7, the water. The clouds form, and the rains fall, and the rivers flow, and the oceans fill. And the clouds form, and the rains fall, and the rivers flow, and the oceans fill. There's no end to the cycle. The oceans never get full. And so it is with the cycles of life, with seemingly no end of all these things that we do again and again and again. And finally, verses 8 through 11. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in ages before. There's no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. Words fail to adequately describe the endless cycles of the patterns of life. We must admit with Solomon that our eyes and our ears, and we might add our stomachs, are never fully satisfied. We go through endless cycles and repetitions to feed our eyes and our ears and our stomachs. How many countless times have we dressed and undressed and combed our hair and washed our faces and got in and out of our cars? You wives and mothers, how many loads of clothes have you done? And how many meals have you prepared? And there's no end to it. And how many hamburgers have we eaten? We eat a sumptuous meal and we're absolutely filled. And several hours later, we are as ravenously hungry as we were before the meal. There's a cyclical repetition to living It is wearisome sometimes, but it's not new. In the days of Noah, over 4,000 years ago, people were eating and drinking, planting and building and marrying and having children and buying and selling, which people have been doing since the beginning of creation. And so we have the phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Technology changes, but people do not change. Derek Kidner, in his excellent commentary in Ecclesiastes, says, in their new guise, the old ways go on. Farmers, bricklayers, judges, woodworkers, love, joy, music, greed, injustice, immorality, lying. We are still making the same mistakes that the Phoenicians were making 30 centuries ago. The coronavirus is a new disease, but through the centuries there have been new diseases which have come and gone, often ravaging nations in their wake, like this one is doing. And what's the ultimate effect of it all? What's the bottom line of the cumulative living of our days? There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. We have the technology to see what's happening in Italy, but the widespread destruction of disease is nothing new. So many things only appear to be new because the past is forgotten. A bubonic plague, historically called the Black Death, in the 1300s killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people in Europe and Africa and Asia. An influenza pandemic between 1918 and 1920 killed an estimated 20 to 50 million people the world over. Many people know nothing about these plagues, which proves Solomon's point. There is no remembrance of former things. Consider this. You spend the whole of your life working, striving, building, developing a certain reputation. You pour your life into your family and your job and a house, and your great-grandchildren will not even remember your name, much less who you were and what you did. Solomon bemoans the seeming insignificance of it all and the repetition. Waking and working and eating and sleeping day in and day out, week in and week out, year after year, decade after decade, until the day comes when we can no longer work. And the day comes that we no longer even sleep well. And the food that we once enjoyed so passionately, our bodies cannot digest properly, and then we die. And what's it all for? We are a droplet in a vast, incalculable sea of humanity, and it often seems that it will not have ever mattered at all that we walked on the earth, at least in the grand scheme of things. What's it all for? What's the gain? That's Solomon's question. It's a dilemma. A disheartening dilemma. Do you feel it? In fact, to press the issue farther, Ecclesiastes reveals that God has designed life in such a way that we cannot see the picture whole as we desire to. The incomprehensible nature of life is by divine design. The Almighty has so ordered things that earthly events do not always fit into our categories, into the patterns that we observe. The patterns do not always hold true. And it's a fair question to ask, why would God do that? Why would he deliberately build into life a frustration? Why design life in such a way that we have so many unanswered questions, like the questions we have about the global killer virus? Why would he do that? The answer certainly is this. God means, in our profound inability to figure everything out, to drive us to himself. He wants us not to trust in ourselves or in the earth around us. Beloved, the creation is not worthy of our dearest affections and hopes. Only the Creator is worthy of our dearest trust. That we cannot see the whole plan does not mean that there is no plan. God is presented in Ecclesiastes not only as the Creator, but as the sovereign, ruling his creation. The inscrutable nature of life drives us to our knees and drives us to our knees before him. That's the purpose. But to the declaration that nothing matters, Solomon answers that because there is a God who is the judge of every person, everything matters. Therefore, the proper context through which to view life is to trust in the Lord and to obey him with reverence, fear God and keep his commandments. That's Solomon's grand conclusion in chapter 12. And further, because there is a God, there is meaning and purpose in life because of his work. What God does has everlasting significance. Listen to chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. God seeks what has been driven away. What God does has eternal meaning. It does not lapse into insignificance. Nothing is lost in his mind. He seeks what is passed by. And so it is God who gives to life, my life, your life, significance. That person is blessed who learns to see all of life in relationship to the Creator of life. This is crucial to remember in these days of crisis. Regarding the endless repetition of everything, Solomon would say, everything is an occasion for worship. A meal is an occasion of thanksgiving to God and recognition that God is the giver of everything and we are the blessed recipients. The taste of potatoes reminds us how good God is to us. Our families are wonderful gifts from God's merciful hand. Marriage is an institution designed to foster praise to him, to echo God's relationship with his people. The sun, S-U-N, becomes a symbol of God's faithfulness and his care. Aging becomes an occasion for thankfulness that there is an eternity of life with God that awaits us. Music, and for married folks, sex, become means of honoring God for the pleasures of his grace. Work becomes an opportunity for joy. which we will appreciate all the more when this crisis is over. The church is a wonderful grace of God's hand, which we will appreciate even more when the crisis is over. With God establishing our lives, there is depth of meaning within the cycles of life. We learn to say with the psalmist, "Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and do confirm for us the work of our hands." Yes, confirm the work of our hands. Every activity in life should be sacred. Relationships, jobs, marriage, use of our money, eating our meals. Life is not simply something I am doing, but something God is doing in me, in us. And everything God does has everlasting significance. And so, O Lord, teach us to number our days, that we may be wise.